Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. My guest for this episode is Professor Vincent Hendricks. He is a professor in formal philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, and he is the director for the Center for Information and Bubble Studies there as well. So I took the train over to Copenhagen to chat with Professor Hendricks about his latest book entitled The Ministry of Truth: Big Tech's Influence on Facts, Feelings, and Fictions. It was co-authored with Camilla Melson and published in Danish in 2021, but it's been updated and translated into English and recently came out this year. So I wanted to pick Professor Hendricks' brain about a number of themes that came up in that book, which is broadly about the power of big tech companies in shaping our public conversation. So in this episode, we'll chat about everything from the attention economy and how this might be boiling over into an attention bubble. We'll also talk about John Stuart Mill and his writings about the free marketplace of ideas and how that's kind of not possible in the current platform ecosystem. We'll also talk about critical infrastructure and how these platforms are more and more controlling the hardware that we use to communicate, what that means for our societies, and cool things like how are social media platforms like casinos. So it's a really wide-ranging interview, and it was fun to do in person. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Vincent Hendricks. Again, he is a professor of formal philosophy at the University of Copenhagen. Professor Hendricks, thanks for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So to start out here, we've had a lot of academic guests on the show, mostly coming from political science and communication, but not so many philosophers. So could you outline for us what formal philosophy is and how its methods or concepts help make sense of democracy during digital transformations?
Certainly. So when you think about formal philosophy, what we really are thinking about here is where math or logic or probability theory can be used as tools for discussing or looking at various philosophical problems. Now, what we are looking at here at the center, so basically being a professor of formal philosophy just means that I'm trained in logic and theoretical computer science. And we use the methods of logic and theoretical computer science to look at information flows or knowledge transitions, et cetera, and everything based on this bilateral deal between attention on one hand and information on the other, but I'm assuming that we're going to get back to that. So basically, you can use math to look at Twitter storms, or you could use logic to look at social interactions. I mean, basically what I am is sort of a combination between a theoretical computer scientist, a logician, but also a professor of philosophy. So in that intersection is really where I'm working at.
We had a guest a while back that was an academic looking at information theory and sort of quantifying like emotions into bits and transferring it. And that really opened my eyes to a different approach. And so here, I guess, are you kind of deconstructing the logic of arguments?
Well, I mean, that's basically in many ways what logic is about, right? But of course, there's a lot more that will sway us than just the force of an argument. So for instance, social influence will sway us, or manipulation would sway us. So there's a lot more to it than basically just looking at whether an argument is logically valid or not. That might not actually convince you all the same. But, you know, enough people of the same cadre as yourself might convince you that you're right along with those, even though the argument they're presenting is invalid, to say. So just to say, there's a lot of more to it than just a logically valid argument for people to pick it up and run with it. And those other things is also what we are looking at.
Interesting. Now, you also lead a research center around information and bubble studies, where we are now. And when it comes to social media, I think many people will jump straight to thinking about filter bubbles.
Sure.
And I'd like to circle back to your thoughts on that later. But there's clearly also financial bubbles, which bubble up time and again throughout history and seem quite relevant for ongoing discussions regarding an attention economy. So in the book, you make several comparisons between the dynamics of social media platforms and financial markets. And I'd like to break down a few of those comparisons. I think most of our listeners are familiar with the general idea of the attention attention economy. Data is the new oil, etc. So maybe let's start with the idea of media as investment bankers. How are mainstream and social media like investment bankers in the attention economy? And please feel free to fill in any context about the attention economy that might help us understand this point.
Sure. Let's start out with the attention economy as such. So that's a term that's being coined in very precisely 1971. And the reason why 1971 is a pivotal date here is because Herbert Simon, who received the Nobel Prize in economics, he was a psychologist by training, but received the Nobel Prize in economics in 1978. But already back in 1971, and mind you, I was 1 year old at that time, he said something very prophetic about an age for which there's a lot of information. He said, in an information-rich world, the wealth of information will mean the dearth of something else. It will be the shorts of whatever it is that information consumes. But what information consumes is pretty obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. And there you have it. There is this exchange. Now, if I feed you information, I gotta have to get your attention in order for you to consume it. And remember, in American English and English, it's you pay attention, right? So it's actually something that you have to pay for in return for something else. Now, what Herbert Simon reminds us of here is that you can grab people's attention using information. But of course, then you can also speculate in what sort of information people are willing to spend their precious attention on and then send that into circulation. And so basically, it means that you have a market where you have a lot of information, you have very limited attention. So how are you going to split that attention on the information available? And so you can speculate it, and so you can build attention bubbles where everybody will talk about the big lie or the big steal, or they will talk about lock her up or things of that nature. They might not be true, but they might capture a lot of attention. And once you get people's attention, that will give you engagement. Once you get engagement, you'll get traffic. Once you get traffic, you will get data. Once you get data, you can harvest it, analyze it, and sell it to the advertisers. And that's the attention economic business model. So basically, you could see that you sort of have a market, but it's a market for attention and information. Now, when I say that social media or media as such, they are sort of attention bankers, that basically means that, so for any show, basically you are speculating in, how do I get listeners? Well, I get listeners by feeding them some information. Once I feed them some information, they will engage. Once they will engage, well, then we have the situation again. I can get traffic, I can get traction, I can get data, and then basically the advertisers might be interested in advertising their products with you. That's how commercial TV is all organized. And so it's basically the same idea here, namely that social media or media outlets as such are speculating in what sort of information will grab people's attention so that the advertisers will compete for eyeballs. And so they're investment bankers.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of paying for attention. And the notion of attention as a currency, or really more of a financial derivative that media institutions broker and swap, starts to complicate the original ethos of social media as platforms establishing a free market of exchanging ideas. So you bring up John Stuart Mill's writings on free markets and opinion exchange from his essay on liberty. I'm wondering if you can recount his argument there and how it applies to social media. And since it's not so often we have a philosophy professor on the show, could you also maybe reflect on what the free in free markets might signify in Mill's thought, and why or why not that might be important to think about when conceptualizing the free market of ideas?
Sure, certainly. Because John Stuart Mill introduced the idea of the free marketplace of ideas. So his basic idea was this, namely that the way in which public discourse is to be pursued is that people throw out their ideas on this marketplace of ideas. And then we will see how well they fare. So if they fare well, people will read and discuss and exchange their opinions about such and so. And the ones who basically get traction, the ones that are robust, they will survive in this market while the others will get weeded out. And so the basic idea of Mill is that we converge to the truth, and that is different from others. But basically Mill says the fact that we exchange our opinions a lot and we have this trading of opinion, in the end will come out such that the true information will survive, but the bad information will get weeded out. But he's assuming one thing. He's assuming a very important thing, namely that there are level playing fields. That means no voices are louder than other voices. That is not something that the social media platforms can honor. And basically the same fundamental idea was what we found in 1996 by John Perry Barlow, right? when he wrote his Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. He sort of feeds into the same idea that this should be the free flow of information, people exchanging their ideas, but he's still assuming that although he didn't agree to the fact that the liquidity of the opinion market would lead to truth, he was of the opinion that there would be level playing fields. Now, neither Mill nor John Perry Barlow would be very impressed with the current information market as it relates to social media, because some voices are heard more than others. And we have seen that also with Frances Haugen's whistleblowing, that there were certain voices are being heard more than others. So you don't have the level playing fields. So when John Stuart Mill talks about free here, it is the freedom to entertain and exercise the opinions that you find are pertinent. Now, whether or not they will get traction, well, that's going to depend on how well they fare in this marketplace of ideas. But the freedom for which you can always say pretty much what you want, and then we'll see how well it fares, how much traction there is, whether it will survive or not.
Yeah, it's interesting. I ask about this idea of freedom in the context of free markets because J.S. Mill is often seen as a key influencer of libertarian ideals. At least let's put it that way during a discussion of social media. And quite a few people have argued that the white, immature college bros of Silicon Valley were initially building these products with code imbued with libertarian values. Now that the business models of the tech ecosystem are more mature, there's more at stake for these companies as public enterprises, and their workforces are more diversified due to a variety of factors, right? Global operations, top talent acquisition, public pressure to diversify. So I'd like to ask, what are your thoughts on the idea that code can be imbued with values, and that these values were originally libertarian due to the like-minded and demographically similar programmers?
Well, I think everybody had the idea, or everybody had sort of the ideal that what could the social media do for us? What could social platforms do for us? Well, it would be an exchange of opinion, pretty much unregulated. But what we didn't think about was that not all voices are heard equally, because there's a Matthews principle is actually in play here. If you already have a lot of followers, the tendency is that you get even more followers, right? Because there's a positive feedback loop that more yields more yields more. That's the reason why you have influencer culture. And those voices are being heard a lot more. So that sort of leaves the level playing fields behind. So on top of that, the basic idea, you could sort of say, well, everybody has a voice. Now, if everybody will be heard on an equitable level to the same extent, then you could sort of say that attention online would follow a normal distribution, right? So the bulk of us could pay and we could receive more or less the same amount of attention. That's not how it works, because attention online does not follow a normal distribution. It's a power law distribution such that a few players sitting on top having by far the most of the action, and then there are the rest of us. So for instance, a good example to this would be the person in the Western Hemisphere with most followers on social media. Who is that? Well, in 2021, this person, broke the 500 million followers, and that's Cristiano Ronaldo. Justin Bieber is in number second. So down to number 10 or something like that, you go from 500 million followers to say 300 million followers, and then you start dropping real rapidly, okay? So it's a very uneven distribution, and the ones who have a lot will tend to get even more. And from that perspective, you could say that yes, in a certain sense, perhaps everybody was of the opinion originally, well, we could all have a voice, we could all get heard. But because of the Matthews principle and the positive feedback loop, some people were heard more than others. And then the social media decided, well, there's a lot of traction with these, so we're gonna do whatever we can to, to at least stimulate the fact that the ones who have a lot will get even more, because it's good for our business model.
Yeah, that was one interesting part of the book, I thought, was this Matthew effect. I actually hadn't heard of that before. Maybe some of our listeners aren't familiar with it. Could you fill us in on what the Matthew effect is?
So the Matthew effect is actually, it came up in social science in a paper written by Robert Merton in 1968 in Science, where he's really looking at what kind of researchers are getting a lot of traction. And what he finds out is the fact that the ones who already have a lot of traction will tend to get even more traction. And so he dubbed that the Matthew effect. And there's a reason for that. So in the New Testament, there is a reference to that. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 25:29, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And that particular principle can be reproduced on this positive feedback loop between getting a lot of attention and acquiring even more. And so from that perspective, that makes the level playing fields an illusion, but it does stimulate a particular way in which certain voices are heard more than others. And as we saw from Frances Haugen's whistleblowing, that Meta or Facebook actually stimulated that for certain users.
This is definitely the first time that the Bible has been quoted on this podcast. And I'm curious to think, I mean, do you think there can be this free marketplace of ideas? Because I'm thinking about this Matthew effect and this power law distribution you were talking about. I mean, in a sense, it's out of necessity because this information needs to be curated some way. And also it fits with the business model so that you can pay to overcome that power law distribution, right? So, I mean, is there even a possible world where there would be some type of technology that allows for an actual equal participation and these ideas to, as you said, kind of compete and let truth preside?
Right, but that's a very good question. But so far, I think we have to admit that we have not found markets that actually operates according to such principles. The same goes for financial markets, right? If you're a libertarian about financial markets, you basically say, let the market roll, and the good things will survive, and the bad services will get weeded out, and that's just the way it is. That's not quite how it works. You can jack this around 20 times from Sunday, right? And when we had the subprime crisis, you could see that very poor financial products could actually live for a while. So that's the reason why we often talk about how should we regulate a financial market such that we don't get there's noise in it that could be very unfortunate. And the same in the information market. That's the reason why there's so much discussion now between Republicans and Democrats in the EU with their Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. How are we going to regulate the tech market? Because so far, quoting the EU, it's just been a cowboy country out there. Everything was allowed, and you saw where that got us. And so that's the reason why that in April this year, 2022, and in May 2022, the EU passed what's known as the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Now, the Digital Markets Act is to level the playing fields among the vendors in the information markets so you don't get monopolies. So that has to do with the market. The Services Act has to do with the fact, who are we as users in this? Is it okay that we are just the products, or that attention and data is the products? How are we going to shield minors from targeted marketing? How should we stimulate recommender-based systems that are not only aggregating a lot of data to profile you, et cetera, et cetera? So these two law packages try to serve both purposes that we have been through here. Regulating the information market ruled by an attention economy, giving an answer to the fact, who are we in this?
Yeah, getting back to this idea of social media and markets, you compare the current state of platforms to the situation of financial markets in the early 2000s. And that gets us into a discussion of good and bad information products and how they're packaged and sold, much like the credit default swaps leading up to the financial market collapse.
Precisely.
Can you describe for us how information is traded like financial derivatives? And do you think we're either in or on the cusp of an attention bubble where a meltdown would lead to ripple effects across other sectors? And what might those sectors be?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the social platforms and social media or the information technologies are now basically looking to capitalize on everything that has to do with information. And clearly, in an information age, that's pretty much everything, right? So they're looking any which way, right? So Facebook would like to have their own currency, right? Libra. The biggest producer of movies today is not Warner Brothers or Sony Entertainment, it's Netflix. And Apple wants Apple News and so forth, and so it goes. So basically just to say that everything that has to do with information is being capitalized on now. Now, when we say that there is a market for bad information products, really what we are saying is that there exists subprime information products that are not, in terms of truthfulness or correctness, anywhere close. But they do have another virtue. They can scrape together or allocate lots and lots of attention. And as soon as you can do that, well, then the business model we talked about before will start rolling for you again, right? So you can talk about subprime information products, like you could talk about credit swaps, or you could talk about the same situation that we had in the early 2000s, where you were basically packaging debt, right? Subprime crisis, what about packaging good debt with bad debt, then syndicate them and then selling them off to these big financial institutions. And once they started looking around going, let's see what we got on our shelves here. So they opened up and they figured there's a lot of bad credit here. And with credit is bad, it's not worth anything because the security is not going to stand up to it, right? So basically we had this crunch. And the same thing we could also look to see to happen at the information market. I mean, that there might be a lot of information products out there. They are really subprime. They get a lot of attention, but it's not good for the market if the market is to be anywhere close to correctness. And that's the reason why we're not getting these legislative packages that we are getting now. But one thing we should realize is that this is very new to us humans, right? I mean, the entire attention economic business model is from 2001. That's when Larry Page and Sergey Brin decided to introduce that model into Google. We know that from Susanna Zubov's Surveillance Capitalism. And then eventually it migrated on to Facebook, and then Instagram and WhatsApp and TikTok and whatever. So now they all use this model, but it's only 20 years ago, Michael. It's not something that we have a lot of experience with yet. So that's the reason why we are having these discussions that we are having now, and also the reason why Camilla and I wrote The Ministry of Truth.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and we've talked about this on the show before. Fake news is cheap. It's cheap to produce, right? Because you can just make something up, whereas high-quality journalism takes
Very expensive product. So you have this situation in the news market where you can produce very bad information products, but they cost very little. Whereas long reads, researched articles, etc., are extremely expensive to do. And on top of that, professional journalists usually have a publicistic ethos that they have to follow, whereas any old person could just produce whatever they want and have no ethos about it. And that's the reason why we have editorial guidelines, etc., etc. So from that perspective, it's an uneven market for the kind of people who are in it, depending on whether they're, only answer back to their own habitus, or for that matter, they would be certified journalists.
Yeah, and it also made me think about, and we've talked about this as well, this idea of, being the product. And so after I read the book, I sort of had this kind of nasty taste in my mouth about that, right? It really kind of hit me because we all kind of know it's happening, but I'm thinking also about these financial derivatives. I mean, even though the companies are moving towards, as you said, this model is new, and they're moving towards packaging basically cohorts of people, and that's supposed to be de-anonymizing at the individual level, but they're packaging our data in sort of groups, and then they have to put a value on that. And that also creates sort of junk bonds and
Precisely.
Things like that. So the idea of our interactions, what we're searching for, what we're revealing about ourselves is being sort of packaged and sold, even though they can't identify us individually. It's kind of a gross idea.
But the basic, so here's the entire point of it, right? One thing is profiling, right? So you go online and you look for a certain product, right? And the cookies are hitting you, and they're taking the data, and so you get more and more commercials for a particular lawn mower or whatever it is that you're looking for. That's one thing. So that's profiling. Fine. That could be on political products, it could be on lawn mowers, doesn't matter. But the interesting thing is really to get predictive power, right? That you have so much data that you can start predicting what it is that you want before you figure it out yourself. And Eric Schmidt, who was the old CEO of Google, actually said in 2011, he said, I don't think people really want to search Google. What they really want is for Google to tell them what they should do next. So once you get the predictive power, that is extremely powerful, right? Because then you can start selling people for political products before they know they need it, or if they need it. And that particular thing is any autocrat's wet dream, to be able to predict what your population wants before they know it themselves.
I just so happen to be watching a lot of Mad Men recently, where they kind of have the same idea, right? It's like we're trying to sell a product that people don't even know they want yet.
Right.
So that model has been around, but I think it's the data and the granularity that...
Well, there are two things. I mean, basically, you could say that the entire idea of an attention economic model for selling newspapers is old. I mean, in our previous book, Reality Lost, we see that the New York Sun back in 1857 had this particular business model. So Samuel Day created the New York Sun. It cost a penny, as opposed to the Washington Post and New York Times, which are much more expensive. But really, the ones who were paying for it were the advertisers. He had some very flamboyant stories about, bad-looking people on the moon who was living a promiscuous life, and very juicy criminal stories about this and that. None of it was true, but clearly the point was different, namely to sell the space to the advertisers. So that model is not new. But what you could say is new, exactly as you were alluding to, is the fact that we never had so much data. We never could do, look, you don't even need to do a sample. You can just use the entire population, and then you can do your statistics on that, right? And so basically, the computational powers joined in with real-time computations basically means that you can monitor everything real time. And that's extremely potent means of power if you want to use it in that way. That's what the social credit system in China is all about, right?
Exactly. We were talking about this federated learning of cohorts as flocks, as a way to group data that would essentially lead to this type of social credit in the form of how valuable are you to this to these companies. But I mean,
yeah, and then you can migrate that over into insurance policies and credit lines and reliability with respect to the state. There are a million ways from Sunday you could use this for every old thing that humans need in a society.
Right, because this is what insurance companies have been doing forever, but now they have some predictive power behind it. But
it could be such that when you drive your Tesla, your premium could change from one drive to the next because the data is sent back, and then you recalibrate your premium because it turns out you're a much more risky driver than they initially thought.
Yeah,
so forth and so forth.
The amount of data that's going to be collected through these smart cars is out of control. But so bring us out of this malaise. I think most people get the sense that something is awry with the current state of digital products and services. And I like this idea you have about this decade being the roaring 2020s and a time to mobilize toward bringing about a more sustainable and democratic digital economy. And you advocate for this mobilization occurring at three levels: the individual, the institutional, and the ideological. I'd like to get into each one, but can you first state why now is the time to get mobilized and what we as users can do at the individual level?
Well, I think it's fair to say that all of a sudden we sort of figured out very recently what the exact business model of these tech companies was. I mean, we weren't really aware of it. And back in 2018, a meme was created, right? Mike Zuckerberg was at the Senate. Orrin Hatch from Utah, who unfortunately died now, asked Mike Zuckerberg, how can you keep up a business where people don't pay for their profiles? And Mike Zuckerberg looked at him and smiled and said, we run ads. And by then, oh, okay, Orrin Hatch goes, that's great. I never thought of that. Probably should. The point I'm trying to make is now we understand where all the money came from, where follow the money means exactly, what does that mean? We understand that now. And it took us a while, but it also took them a while to introduce it and capitalize on it and whatnot. I mean, until 2011, Facebook was not making any money, but then they introduced the same model because Sheryl Sandberg came from Google to Facebook and introduced that model that Google had been introducing 10 years before. Anyhow, so the reason why we're doing it at the Roaring 20s is now we understand what follow the money means. Now we are also seeing the consequences of that. Everything from the insurrection 1 year to misinformation campaigns, Russian interventions. We see now how this ecosystem is actually putting a big dent in us. It influences our everyday. So we came up, Camilla and I, with three modes of mobilization, right? So one is what we call individual mobilization, read digital literacy. Now, we have developed a digital literacy program for upper secondary school and high school here in Denmark, which we're also referring to in the text, but that's not out in English. So that's one thing. So one thing is it should be a part of the educational packages, right? And that we should educate for digital literacy no matter how old we are, because we are all in this together. So that's the individual mobilization. Then there is the institutional mobilization. And what we mean by that, we saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, of course, a lot of misinformation was spreading during the pandemic about, well, where did it come from? How can you acquire it? How do you get out of it, etc. And the World Health Organization teamed up with Facebook, actually, to do a joint partnership for correcting some of these misunderstandings and the conspiracy theories and whatnot. So we're going to see new partnerships. And let me remind you all that the 17th SDG, UN SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, is actually new partnerships. And it's new partnerships to realize the remaining 16. So we also introduce in the book, or we suggest in the book, that we should have an 18th goal called sustainable tech. Then the final part of it has to do with ideology, read policy making, yeah? And so we go through the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and we should also realize that although, of course, Republicans and Democrats in the US have not been able to agree on anything much lately, right? There is one place where there is bipartisan agreement, and that bipartisan agreement came after Frances Haugen's whistleblowing, and that is something has to be done about big tech. And of course, the way the Americans have been approaching this over the years is when companies grow too big, we're going to hit them with antitrust. And that's been working pretty well, right? I mean, over the years, Standard Oil got into problems, Kodak, Microsoft, whatever. Now, what happened in the 80s was that the Chicago School sort of convinced lawmakers in Washington that they should only apply antitrust if it was a disadvantage to the users that some company could set the price on, cell phones or whatever you have. But since you get your profiles for free, that could never be a disadvantage. So you didn't really use it. But now you sort of see that both Democrats and Republicans are saying they're just simply going too big. And the Republicans came up with a pretty interesting thing because, of course, as of December 7th, 2021, Trump, who was a publicly elected president, you can think about him whatever you want, but he was publicly elected. He was robbed of his voice to the new social square, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all the others, which basically mean that public space is on private hands now. Now, if you had asked the Enlightenment thinkers whether or not that should ever happen, they would be saying no. But Facebook, Google, Instagram, and all the others got together and said, look, we're gonna ban him, deplatforming day. Now, what are we going to do about that? Because you can say a lot about Trump, but he was publicly elected. So should private enterprise decide whether or not he should have a voice in public space? Probably not. Probably not. So the way that the Republicans have been thinking about it sometimes is to say, well, if Facebook thinks that they are so big that they can silence a publicly elected official, it's time for us conservatives to pursue an antitrust agenda. Jim Banks said that. Now that's, when you hear it first, you go, okay, well, reasonable enough. However, if you think about it twice, it's a pretty radical statement because you're saying that a democratic value, freedom of speech, should be secured by antitrust means, which is a fiscal operation on a market to ensure a democratically instilled value, which is, at best, pretty radical, right? Because that's not how we think about democratic values, that they somehow should be controlled by fiscal means. And that's the reason why we call the book The Ministry of Truth. It's from Orwell, obviously, 1984. But we are not saying big tech is like a ministry of truth in Orwell, which is basically a ministry for propaganda and lies or in historical revisionism. We are saying that they basically own the infrastructure on which the information society is built, and they also decide what gets to have a voice and what's not heard, what's being downgraded, what's being upgraded, what's being shadow banned, etc. So both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality, they are sort of a ministry of truth, although Mark Zuckerberg has been saying on more than one occasion, I don't think that Facebook nor any other platform should be an arbiter of truth.
Yeah, I remember, so I'm a big fan of these dystopian novels. I'm sure some of the listeners are as well. And I think it's in Brave New World when the protagonist, he's getting retrained, right? He's getting sort of tortured for years. You don't know how long it is in the book. And then it eventually becomes normal for him. And there's a very powerful point in the book where he looks in the mirror and he sees he has no hair, he has no teeth, he's brutalized, right? And I do wonder if that is some type of reckoning that we'll all have as individuals when we're sort of caught up in we should be posting regularly and getting followers and chasing likes. And then when we kind of take a step back, will there be this kind of reckoning moment where we say, what have we been doing the past 10 years?
Yeah, I think we might just have that. I mean, we have an entire chapter in the book is called The Clandestine Casino. And
yeah, this was interesting about how casinos are designed with rounded corners so you kind of don't have these sharp edges. No clocks in a casino, never thought of that.
No windows. You can't see what time it is. And the argument is, don't let the players ever think that they could know what time it is. You have to get them sucked into the zone where they're just there playing along. And all those casino tricks are being implemented on platforms as well as, of this varying reward business, just like a one-armed jack. And a cell phone, in a certain sense, is a one-armed jack. I don't know whether somebody liked my latest post. So what do? I log on and check. The more data will be generated, the more can be sold to the advertisers, right? So that's basically reward psychology. And that has been introduced on social media platforms. And if you ask people in general, do you consider yourself as an autonomous person making qualified decisions on your own about this and that? I think default we will say, pretty much, pretty much by and large. But it's also under influence now because that is basically a way of manipulating us into stay online because that's good for business. And there are a million tricks in the books that you can use for that. And that's what B.J. Fogg figured out. Elon Musk took that course at Stanford, right? The guy who started Hewlett-Packard did that. The guy who did Instagram. So those tricks that have been used by the casino industry for the past 100 years to keep the players fixed in the casino are also being introduced on social platforms now.
And what's interesting is that I'm thinking about TikTok being the latest iteration of this, right? Highly addictive. And so what you essentially have is long gone are the days of Facebook and Twitter. Now there's multiple social media platforms, and these are essentially competing in a market to out-game each other in being more and more addictive. So we're getting hit on multiple fronts.
Right. More addictive and more data-driven, right? And so TikTok is a prime example of that. It's extremely addictive, and it collects oceans and oceans of data. That's the reason why it works so well.
Yeah.
See?
Yeah.
And that's the argument we always get, Michael. Why can't I just get a profile without you taking my data? And the argument, it has to be free. And we all know that's not free. I mean, we're paid with attention and data. But the argument why they keep saying we need more data is because you get better searches. It's better for the user experience. But what we tend to forget on the way, that's true. We might get better user experiences, but the remaining profits are just in the pockets of the big tech.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I don't know if this is true, but apparently in the terms and conditions of TikTok, it's like they can harvest your keystrokes and all sorts of stuff, like really not just on the platform, but also off platform as well, as we've seen with cookies and pixels and these types of things. But, getting back to these ideas of solutions, you lay out an interesting argument about using CAPTCHAs to introduce a friction strategy while also educating users on platforms' community guidelines. And this might be a way to get around this kind of creepiness of TikTok seeing what you're typing off the platform as well. So could you kind of outline that argument about how CAPTCHAs could be brought in?
Sure. Okay, so the basic idea, it came to me maybe 6 months ago. I was giving a talk to the Danish parliament about these issues. And so it all of a sudden dawned on me that almost nobody has read the community standards of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever community standards of their preferred platform. So I figured, suppose you do a CAPTCHA such that whenever you're about to log on to your Facebook profile or just about to hit the retweet button, you're being asked 3 questions randomly generated about the community standards of the platform of your choice. And if you can answer those questions, then you can go on your merry way and do whatever it is. And if not, then you have to go back and study these, and then you can answer those, and then you can get going on your merry way. It's a way to introduce a friction strategy based on the community standards that the platform of your choice is using. That should be of everybody's interest. It should be interest to the platforms, because that means all the content moderation money they're using right now to moderate the content of the users, maybe they could use a little less of that. It would also be good for the users, because the users would understand what are the conditions under which I'm operating in this public space. That would be good for me as well. So right now we are actually working with the University of Indiana, Bloomington, and one of my PhD students, Laura John, is over there to see if we can do a little pilot of such a friction strategy based on the community standards.
But this is like putting a clock in a casino. This is going to pull us out of the zone.
That's exactly right. But it's also a way for the users to understand the conditions under which they're operating in the public space that they are lending. I say lending, not owning, lending by the platform of their preference.
I like the model. I hate the idea of doing more CAPTCHAs. They're very annoying.
But that's the entire point of CAPTCHAs. Slow down speed. Because right now, speed is not working with us, it's working against us. The more the speed, the less we reflect, the more chances are that we are going to get bamboozled one way or the other, or do not reflect properly, etc. So if we could slow down things with which we have to make decisions, maybe that will be good.
So I have a couple last questions for you here. One is on the idea of infrastructure and hardware. I think one of the things I liked about the book is you're one of the few people who's paying attention to the infrastructures, the hardware, the underwater sea cables, the fiber optics. And we've talked about that a bit on the show, about how this model is changing to being more decentralized. I mean, what's the implication of these companies moving into the hardware business? I mean, we as users benefit to some extent because data is faster, but what are your thoughts on that?
That is disconcerting. That troubles me probably the most. I wrote a paper for the OECD not long ago, right when we were finishing the American version of the book, where I asked myself a pretty obvious question, namely, how many of the critical infrastructure sectors have big tech got their hands in? So we take those, they're usually considered to be 9, right? From transportation on one hand to fresh water on the other to electricity on a third. And so it all of a sudden dawned on me, out of those 9 critical infrastructure sectors, big tech has their hands in 8. Only 1 they don't have their hands in yet, and that's water supply. But that will only be a matter of time when we think about water shortages in the US, in Europe, all over the place now. You need it for water cooling. These gigantic data mining centers You need it for everything. It's going to be in short supply. So big tech has an interest in that too. They're not into it. But what they are into are the fiber optics that makes up what we understand the internet to be. In 2010, Facebook, Hewlett-Packard, I think Google was in on it too, maybe Amazon, I forgot, decided to do one transatlantic cable between East Coast US and actually Denmark, where the outlet is, and further into the world. What they are interested in doing now is basically having fiber optic cables across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, 30 cables up towards 2028, I believe it is. And that means that they will virtually own the physical incarnation of the internet. They will own it. Not only primary purveyors, they will own the highways, the street signs, the cars, but they will also own whatever ads you will see on the way and what you can and cannot do. That is an extremely powerful position to be in. And so our entire communication infrastructure is on private hands. I would much rather have the UN sit on that than private enterprising for democratic reasons. Yeah? And so that's actually a huge concern, because realize that usually countries are not too happy about critical infrastructure being outsourced too much, because you lose control. You basically lose control. We tend to do it ever so often, but we also usually pretty careful about it. We are seeing it right now in Europe, right? We are seeing it in the US. Transportation right now is tricky, right? Because gas prices are very high, electricity prices are high, gas prices are high. That's critical infrastructure. So if you control that, you control a country. But if you control the information infrastructure that even nation states are using, then that's pretty potent power. I'm not sure we want to go there.
Yeah, I can't particularly look forward to WhatsApp water.
Right.
But we've been discussing a lot about social media and their business models in market terms, which you argue is leading up to this attention bubble. And because you are the director for the Center for Bubble Studies, I thought to ask you about your idea about filter bubbles, because I think that's kind of the first one that comes to mind for a lot of people. What are your thoughts on filter bubbles and the associated idea of echo chambers? Are these, in your view, useful concepts for us to think about as a society?
Absolutely. When Eli Pariser came up with the idea of filter bubbles, that he was ahead of his time when he did that. He didn't necessarily have too much data to support it, but it's been shown, and we did also a book in 2016 called The Info Storms, where we argue that social psychological traits, from lemming effects or informational cascades to bystander effects, the social media platforms are very hospitable to all of those. And that will lead, polarization eventually will lead to echo chambering. And there's a host of papers on Nature and Science and elsewhere, PNAS and whatnot, that goes to show that, yes, we do polarize online. Yes, there are echo chambers online. Yes, there are homophilies of people who are in agreement about such and so. And it's not magic here. It's like who we are, right? We tend to group up with people that we agree with and tend to be against people we don't agree with. And those conditions have been with humans probably as long as we have been humans, but they have not gotten worse conditions online.
Then what do you make of the evidence that shows that, for example, algorithms expose people to diverse opinions, or the argument that you can sort of find an echo chamber based on how the data is delivered?
Sure.
and you slice it?
Yeah, I think that's true too. But these two things are not, they couldn't probably both be false, because then what's the point? But they could both be true. The point is we don't know how much is one thing and the other. And why? Because getting data to check is so difficult. We can't get the data from the social media platforms, basically because that's part of their secrecy of business, right? And so it's like asking Coca-Cola for the recipe. So we can't get complete data sets. So until we start getting more complete data sets as to how much has to do with the information being packaged in how way, while the other thing has to do with echo chamber effects, as we know them as social psychological effects, until we get some more data, it's hard for us to check. But they could both be true. The question is how much of one is true and how much the other true.
An open question that still remains to be explored. But Professor Hendricks, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us. This has been fun.
Thanks for having me very much.
I've just been speaking with Vincent Hendricks, professor of formal philosophy at the University of Copenhagen. You'll find a link to the book we've been discussing down in the episode description. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we have elections in Sweden, so Dr. Nils Gustafsson from Lund University will join us to talk about the elections and the role of social media in them. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.